Hey class, we're going to be using charcoal pencil, and I wanted to talk to you about it. You're going to be needing also these ones, which are called compressed charcoal. They look like big sticks. Let me open it up for you and show you. These you don't need this week, but you're going to need them soon. They're like big, if you ever worked with pastels before, they're kind of like big pastels. But they're made out of charcoal. They're called compressed charcoal. So you're going to need compressed charcoal coming up soon. But this week, what you need is the charcoal pencil. And you're going to need a kneaded eraser to go with them. That's the ones that are like silly putty that you've been using. Okay? So we're going to talk about using value to add realism to our drawings. Value is the lightness and darkness of tones, like you see here. And we're going to talk a little bit about how light works and the logic of how light works. It emanates out of a single point. So a lot of this will be obvious, but I want to make it clear. You have a candle or anything. Light goes in every direction out from it, right? And I want you to think about what's the most powerful light source here in the world. Pause for a moment to make you think about it. It's pretty clear. The sun, right? So, the sun is way up in the sky and it emanates from every direction from the sun. In a way, you could think about it as a giant, giant candle. Okay? How else does light work? Think about it. Do you know anything about physics, hopefully, or something of that nature? Well, let's draw on the screen here for a second. Here's the light source in this painting, and it's pretty accurate. It goes out every direction, right, from it. You see that? And when it hits something that's shiny or refracts the light, like glass or crystal, or shiny, it bounces around and moves around the environment. It does this with almost everything, but not so much with things like the wood of the desk or things like that, things that absorb more light. And it bounces around the environment. That's because it travels in a straight line. Okay? Different objects and materials absorb a different amount of light. And so things like dirt and pavement, there's not a lot of bouncing of light. It's just going straight into it, and that's what you get. The color that you see of something is what is bounced back. Yeah? Hopefully you've learned about this before. You see the color that bounces back. Every other part of the light gets absorbed by the object. That's why if something's really, really shiny, we see white there. Because it's reflecting back all the light, almost all the light off the metal, for example. Or these little spots on the glass right here are called highlights. So we know a bit about how light works. It's also want to just point out how that's how you see texture. So in anything, say this little eraser, you can see some of the texture on it. We see everything through light, but wherever there's little bits of shadow, it helps us know that something's not smooth. Okay, this is a little sanding block for charcoal. It's basically how we get a feeling of depth to a piece, like a window into another world, realistic lighting. This is from the Renaissance, and a lot of work in the Renaissance, it has that sort of realism. We could say, ultimately though, it is also kind of abstract because it's not perfect like a photograph. And even a photograph, because it's capturing something that's 3D and 2D, can become quite abstract pretty quickly. But it has a way, way higher level of realism than, say, like cave painting in Paleolithic times, right? When we draw light, we're actually using tones. So we're using our pencils and charcoal to apply tones to the paper. And in that way, we begin to almost be more like painters in the sense that we're using shapes of a certain tone. I want to talk to you about some of the terminology. A highlight, like I said, is where the light is bouncing. So in this picture, the light is coming from here and illuminating this whole side of the candlestick. And the brightest spot is there. That's called a highlight. Anything over here, and this part of it is in the shade. Okay? And these are the cast shadows. Sometimes you have like a couple light sources, so you could have a secondary cast shadow from another light source. But wherever it cuts off is like the cut line. See how it always matches the edges of objects. In the middle of the shadow is what we call the core shadow, the darkest part of it. Because when light comes out of a source, every way, it bounces around because it travels in a straight line. It bounces around the surface and the environment. And it goes back up into the piece and creates what we call reflected light. So that's pretty clear, but I just want to keep making the terminology even clearer. Here is a picture of just another simple picture. Sorry, the little drawing thing stayed on. Of shadow, what's cast by something, and shading or shade, which is on a subject, okay? Just to make that clear. We have the subject, casts a shadow, and shading is on the subject. The direction of the light will change a lot of the shadow especially, but also where the shade is, of course. But we notice especially in shadows. If it's at like a 45-degree direction, what's casting this edge here is actually the top, right? Because it's not hitting over here. It's hitting all light over here, and it's casting on itself. So this edge is casting that shadow, and we see it pretty clearly with the box. But when you get, this is almost 45-degree light. You can see how the light source is coming from here, and it's coming down, and you're getting all the shadow on this side of the face because it's coming from the front, and this whole side is shadow, right? His side is sort of turned from the light, so we get a lot of shade over here. Just an example of it in a painting. And then we get, if light source comes from the side, like if you're walking down the street at night, or when it's dusk, I should say, and the lights behind you, you see your shadow in front of you get really long and big. It creates these long shadows, right? Pretty obvious, because this whole part here is creating shadow. The light's going up that way, but all of this is going way out there. I mean, the shadow is going way out there because the light is hitting here, stopping on the object, and the shadow has been cast, and it takes a lot longer for the light to get all the way over here, to get the further distance. Not longer time-wise, so I mean light travels so fast. I guess we shouldn't say longer, I should say less. The light is not hitting over here because the angle of it is hitting the book and it's creating a longer shadow. The speed is not really the point. This is an example of the light from the side of the face. So it's coming in like that. We're closer to this side angle of the face. And then this is casting all of the shadow this way. He's close to something right behind him. That's why we can see the shadow on the wall almost, or whatever it is behind him. So that's an example of that in a painting from the Renaissance era. Another example, light really striking. In a lot of work from this era, they like to use this high chiaroscuro emerging out of the background of blackness. Really, really deep shadow, so it shows it very well. That's why I use a lot of these type of examples. It creates a lot of drama in this work, and that was the purpose of it, like Baroque work. When it's directly above the source, it really is barely any shadow, and sometimes like at noon we get barely any shadow in the world too, right? Just whatever has, we get it in certain places, but not very much, right? A lot less. It's pretty obvious, but we want to just make sure, because you see these things in the world, you know it, but you don't ever maybe make it concrete and say, oh, okay, that's what we're trying to replicate. This is what's happening. And this is an example of This is actually not a photograph. It looks amazingly photorealistic, but it's actually made out of charcoal, which is what you're using. So this is actually the possibility of realistic rendering of tones with this pencil that you have. You should have probably a soft and a medium one, but this is what he would have used, these type of tools, and then a blending stump to create this. Pretty amazing, really, when you think about it. Even if it was paint, it would be amazing. But I'm 90% sure it's charcoal. Now I'm starting to doubt myself. Nope, it's charcoal. Alright, this is an example of Vincent van Gogh using it in a way more abstract way. Not full abstraction, of course. You can still see his subjects, but he's a post-impressionist, so he's not necessarily concerned with rendering like Chuck Close. But he's still using the light in a realistic way, according to the logic of how light works. When I say light logic, I'm not saying light has a mind, but that it works in a way that's logical and consistent. Light logic means the consistency of how it works. We also sometimes get light sources emanating out of the middle, like this scene, and this is a silhouette because he's front lit, and we're just seeing the back of him. When something's backlit, it also creates a totally different vibe. So we see this person's silhouette because the light's emanating. Where do we get this? At night with campfires or lights, in the middle of a group of people or objects. But basically, a lot of this is about observation of the direction of the rays of light. So the source of it and which angle of it and how high it is and then where it's hitting on the object. And we can think about a lot of this. These are just really simple illustrations, but if you use a lot of these type of lines at first, you do a little circle and then kind of helps you to create a little bit of a notation on your paper, and it'll help you see, okay, everything there has to be being hit by the light, and light is always striking directly in a line, so whatever's on the other side of it, it might be even casting some shadow on the object or person in different areas, right? So we're really trying to understand the logic of how it works so we can create more accurate drawings. Values, lightness and darkness of tones are seen in relationship to each other. So in the world we have full values as much as our eye can see, and everything's in relationship to that, in relationship to the light source, what time of day it is, how much light there is, but in relationship to each other. This shows you what I mean. This is middle gray right here. This is black, and that's white. The scan's not perfectly good, but it's the same tone in the middle of each piece, but it appears quite light over here and pretty dark over there because of what's around it. We're working in an achromatic medium. That means without color. And I have some terminologies on the project sheet that I want you to just understand, so when we're talking and relating to each other and talking about the work and the discussions, you understand kind of what to use, what words make sense to everyone, the vocabulary. But we're looking at a world of color, and so we have to kind of learn how to translate color into a tone, because color does have a tone. It does have an equivalent black and white tone to it. So here's an example with a green apple and using it to create the tone red apple and green apple, right? A green apple is actually a lighter tone because it has yellow in it, and red is darker. If you squint your eyes and look at them side by side, you would see that even though they're colored, this is a lighter and this is a darker. And how you could get a base tone and then add more shadow onto the subject, shade I should say, and then highlights and the cast shadow, and they would look similar, but we could differentiate between the two based on the relative tone of the color. You can see it here as well with a yellow box, a cube in the middle that is, I believe, deeper tone, so it's like red, and then this would be like something like a dark purple. So you see how they're different. The same idea though. Yellow is the lightest, and generally speaking, a dark bluish purple is actually the darkest color. A lot of what we get black-wise, if you see it fade out, it starts to kind of become bluish, purplish, is because those are the darker tones. We've been kind of working with this already, and maybe you didn't realize it, but line weight, how thick or thin the line is. What do I mean by line weight? Here it is right here. That's a thick line weight. That's an even thicker line weight, right? It has value to it. And then we have a really, really thin line weight that also has value to it. You can see it here with the hair at the back, and these ones at the front. The lines are thicker, and there's also more of them. But the weight of the line, that's the weight of the line, gives you value. And it's how you show distance and a bunch of other things. And you probably know this already because you observed it and your mind automatically is used to it. But we don't always talk about it and really become really specific with the language that we're using in the concept. So this is part of value that you've been using, and the lightness and darkness of line with a pencil is created through what? How do you do a darker line? More pressure and a softer lead. So if you use a softer lead, charcoal is much softer than pencil, and do the same amount of pressure, the charcoal will be darker. But sometimes you can't do any more pressure without, snapping something, so you need to switch to a softer lead pencil, right? And that's why I have you guys using H and B pencils, because they help with that type of thing. Value and line weight also is used for what they call modeling values. That's creating the value, modeling it to make it look like it's lifelike. It can be used really expressively. This portrait over here by Kathy Kolitz would have been done with something either like this or a charcoal stick of some type, probably another type called willow charcoal or vine charcoal. And this is how in a lot of ink drawings people do what's called hatching and cross-hatching, the line work to create value. And if you took my design class, we do a project where we do a bunch of stuff with lines, and one of them is you have to create value through lines, and that's how you would do it. There's a lot of different styles of doing this. I mean, we say hatching and cross-hatching really to mean hatching is one directional and then cross-hatching is the other direction. We're going to do something later in class which is called contour. We've been doing contour drawings, but it's called cross-contour drawing, which is you matching the surface like a little ant is traveling down the surface. In a way, you're matching it and also adding value, so that relates to that. We'll be doing that later, but this is just to give you an idea of how this is used in various art forms. But we're going to be trying to really create our drawings at first with shapes of tone. What do I mean by shapes of tone? Well, tone is the value with you creating with your charcoal pencil, and it's creating certain shapes on the form. And some of them are darker and some of them are lighter, right here, for example, right? That's one sort of whole tone, and there's one over here. But each of these different tones, these patterns of tone, create something that feels like we would see, right? We're going to be using these to try to create a continuous tone. And although this is color, it has a continuous tone. It doesn't stop or start. It's blended, but it has still shapes of tone. And that's what creates something that feels real. This is a color version. Let me show you an example of a color painting with black and white next to it. This is an example of one piece that's totally in color the way people know it. It's famously shown. And this is it side by side in black and white. And you can see how the realism of the color, it's not perfectly real like a photo, but it's realistic, translates, all these colors translate into a tone of gray, black, or white, so a black and white medium. And this value pattern, this continual value pattern in the whole space creates a realistic version, just like a black and white photograph, right? This is what I'm talking about here in a photograph. This is a famous photograph called Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange. The last piece was, just say, Giovanni. It's Domenica Giraldo by Giovanni on tempera on oil. This is from the 1930s, 1936, where there was the Dust Bowl and Depression happening. and these people went around and took pictures that were hired by the government to document things. You can see how each of these tones that are down here correspond to a piece of the photograph. What I mean, if you line them up, you can actually see how you can identify certain ones of these tones throughout the space. Like right here, matches pretty close to that. The black, there's a really light tone in the face. There's not a lot of white, but there are certain points that have white in them almost. So you can see these continuous tones, and this is just an example of the value scale, 10 steps that are in order from dark to light and have a logical amount of a leap at the same distance on the value spectrum between them. So they're jumping at an equal distance up the value scale, jumping up the same amount each time. You're going to be doing one of these because I want you to kind of be able to identify value and how it jumps and get a difference so it doesn't just feel like, oh, haphazard. And it takes some time to actually observe it and to get it accurate. It works in the world of design and abstraction as well. Like this is a famous painting by Picasso called Guernica. Both of these were designed to be in black and white and gray. And it creates a really interesting piece. It's pretty intense about the Civil War, and so we get a really intense feeling in it. But it happens through all these tonal shifts, and there's some line work happening here in this painting. It's a bit different than maybe other paintings that are continuous tone, or photographs that have a continuous tone, right? These are both continuous tone. This is happening with some line work, but I wanted to put this in here to show you guys that even really abstract things or things that aren't so real have this going on. It's part of the whole world of art, design, and the world around us. So we're trying to understand how the world is working and how we can make things that reflect the world. And so when we're working, we're going to be trying to get as accurate as possible. But it's going to be a drawing. It's not going to be a photograph. Our goal isn't photorealism, but it is realism. So we want to work with the pattern of tone in a way that light works, the logic of how light works. So your first assignment is to replicate 10 values spaced equally using a charcoal pencil, and the first tone will be the white of the paper. Why is that? Because the whitest you can get is the paper you're working on when you're using white paper. If you're using your newsprint, then you would need to add like some kind of white charcoal or white medium to get white. So you're going to be using white paper for this, your sketchbook, and you're going to create boxes around these. So what does that mean? It means you're actually going to draw them neatly with a ruler. You need to have a ruler for class and measure them. You'll see me do this on the demonstration, but I just want to make it clear in multiple areas so you kind of really know what we're dealing with and you're not surprised. A box, and measure out equal spaces. So like a 10-inch box, 10 inches, an inch by inch square would be perfect, or inch and a half by inch and a half, depending on how big of the paper you're working on in your sketchbook. And then have them nice and neatly laid out, and then you're going to do a tone in each one. I recommend to you that before you try to fill up the boxes that you have nicely laid out, that you take your extra piece of paper in your sketchbook and you actually test out some tones by carefully building them up and seeing how much pressure and how it works to try to get all these figured out beforehand. And you build them up, and then you pick and say, okay, this one's number 10, this one's number 2, and work your way through them and get them equally spaced. It seems easy, and you're going to see, oh, this is stupid, why am I doing this? Because it'll actually really help you, and it's not as easy as it seems. It's deceptive, basically. It's easy. It seems like, oh, it'll take no time at all, but to do it right, you actually have to spend some time figuring it out, because we're not used to having to do this a lot of the time, unless you've done a lot of shading. Some of you may have, but overall, we're not actually used to being really careful with this. We just want to draw things. And so far, we haven't done any of this in class, so it's going to take a little time. You're not going to want to just try to do it 5 minutes before it's due, okay? And then the other assignment you're going to be doing is taking, and you're going to be drawing a sphere, and I'll have a picture of that as well in there, and you're going to be making it as good as, as perfect as you can, and then picking a light source, and then you're going to be accurately shading it fully from the light source. And I'll have a picture you're going to be replicating, because I presume most of you don't have spheres sitting at home ready to do this. Later on, we'll actually be doing it from objects you find at home, like a glass or a cup or something, and then we'll build up our ability with this, but it's going to take a bit of time. It's something that people usually like once they realize they can do it, because they start to feel like, okay, all this stuff I've been learning, it's actually going to help me be able to draw in a way that feels, maybe you're not going to be as good as Van Eyck. Most people in the world throughout the history haven't necessarily been as good as him. There's a reason he's in art history. Well, he's also earlier. Now there's probably plenty of people, but early on, that, we're not expecting that, but we want you to be able to work through and really get some realism happening in your drawings by observing the light and dark and really paying attention to it. Okay? The one thing I want to do is tell you is a really good way to do this is, if you squint your eyes when you're looking at a scene, and even the picture, it helps you focus on the pattern of the tone rather than the detail. So if you really squint your eyes, you can see the pattern, the tonal patterns, and then you won't be worried about every little detail. You still draw accurately without your eyes squinted, of course, and get something that looks pretty accurate proportionally. And then doing that will help you distinguish between tonal shifts. So that's something, that's a trick that I'll tell you a couple times so you understand it more and more as we go along. Okay guys, so this pretty much takes you through the ideas behind using value to add realism to your drawings. And there's a part of it that you could totally study fully and scientifically, and it's interesting. But we're going to be, using these ideas. Generally speaking, I don't expect you to understand the physics of light or something, but I just want you to kind of know the terminologies that are on your sheet and be able to understand the concept, and then we're going to put it into practice. Let me pull up that project sheet so we can go over a couple terminologies real quick. Sphere assignment. You're going to create that value scale right there using charcoal pencil, equally spaced. You're going to create a copy of the sphere. There'll be a drawing in here. Use the images of them, value scale and sphere on the page. You do the scale first because it's going to take you time to figure it out, and then you're going to use that to help recreate the sphere. You got to do them, try to do them as perfectly as possible. Doing it correctly will take time. You do the 2H pencil for sketching out the shape of the sphere, laying it out, a ruler for laying out the 10 boxes, and then you're going to need charcoal pencil, like I emailed you guys about, a kneaded eraser, and then you're going to use, you can use your sketchbook as long as it is white paper. You don't have to use a giant piece of 18 by 24 paper. You're going to submit the photographs of your drawing or scans if you're having trouble with the photograph. I really prefer you to do photographs because I can see the paper much better. It hasn't been cleaned up or changed as much. You want to have them on neutral background. This should be, you should have white space around in your sketchbook, so that won't be a problem. You don't need to submit more than one. Here's some vocabulary. Value, we talked about relative lightness or darkness of color or tone. Black and white are still are of course colors. In relationship to each other. Chiaroscuro, I didn't mention this, I kind of briefly did. This is a pictorial representation of light and dark and shade. It originated in the Italian Renaissance. Achromatic means no hue, so it's black, white, neutral. Cast shadow, that's cast by the form. Shadow or shading, we talked about those. The shadow or shading is on the form. You could say cast shadow or shadow, but shading and shadow can be on the form. Core shadow is that darkest area on the form not being hit by the reflected light. I showed you an example of that. And then reflected light is the one that's bouncing all around and then goes back onto the form from the surroundings. The highlight is the lightest part. Usually it's receiving the most light, and it's also shiny. Oftentimes something that's more shiny. But it doesn't have to be shiny to be the highlight in the piece because it's relative. Light logic. This is what I was saying when I said it's a pattern, that it creates a value pattern, and it's the idea that light interacts with form in a logical, expected manner, so we're understanding the logic of how light works. You got to follow the assignment directions. I've had problems with this. It seems that people aren't really reading the project sheets very well. And creative resolution on this assignment, this is always the criteria. There's not a lot of creative resolution, it's just following it. This is more of an exercise. But how much you refine and complete the work definitely is part of this. And this one, this is just always the grading criteria. There's not a lot of conceptual clarity here. It's just showing your exploration of the drawing media definitely is part of this, though, because I'm going to do demonstrations and how well you use your strokes and pay attention to the edges of the boxes and how clean they are. They need to look clean. They're not supposed to look like all over the place, like, oh, I just got a little tone, whatever, it's fine. I just drew it in here and it got sort of accurate. Oops, I'm using the lineman. I just got a little tone, it's fine. It needs to be cleanly to the edge, well laid out. This is part of your lab time. So you're going to have to pay attention to how the strokes are and really do the work that way. Don't cut corners on this type of stuff. Okay? So that should take you through it pretty clearly. I think, trying to pull that PowerPoint down so it's not showing everywhere. That should take you through pretty cleanly, and it will be pretty easy to understand, but you got to spend, it's easy to understand, but you need to take some time and actually do it. And then you can upload JPEGs, PNG, and PDF files. They're easiest to read for me to grade, okay? This sort of more technical just exercise is going to help us build up to being able to do this with still lifes and things we see. And later in the class we'll be using it. If we get a chance, it depends on how we progress and how much we kind of are able to work through our different sections, and also if you're understanding things or feeling like you need more time, or I based on seeing your work, I'm thinking, okay, they need a little more time with this, I'll add an exercise or something. But hopefully we may get to the chance at the very end where we might do a self-portrait or more of an advanced sort of still life that would help you guys be able to really take this into that realm of realism as much as possible. Alright guys, so I'm happy that you're all engaging in the work, and I want to keep encouraging you to ask questions if you have problems, or set up a Zoom meeting with me if you need to, so that I can help you through this. But it's, sometimes people take art and think, oh, it's just a blow-off class, it doesn't matter. But really it's a discipline. It's a whole discipline unto itself. It's got a long history. It's something that we value for all kinds of reasons in society, and you're engaging with that dialogue and terminology helps you see the world and think about the world and understand it in new ways. And so it requires time just like any other class. So I think you all have great potential and you're doing good work, so keep on going with it, and reach out if you need help, okay?